What was announced as a ceasefire did not even make it through 24 hours. At 6:38 p.m. Eastern Time yesterday, Donald Trump went on Truth Social and declared victory. He said the United States and Iran had agreed to a 2-week pause. He said the Strait of Hormuz would reopen. He said almost every major point of contention had been resolved. And in his own words, we have already met and exceeded all military objectives. By this morning, that narrative was already collapsing. Oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz received a message from the Iranian Navy. Any vessel trying to travel into the sea will be targeted and destroyed. Not warned, not delayed, destroyed. The strait is closed again. The ceasefire is functionally dead. And now Trump, the same man who, 48 hours ago, warned that an entire civilization could die tonight, is sitting in the White House watching the deal he celebrated come apart in real time. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how a ceasefire that was supposed to save the world evaporated in less than one news cycle. Why the Lebanon loophole is the most dangerous diplomatic failure of this entire war. And what happens to oil markets, global shipping, and American consumers when the strait goes dark again. Because this isn't a pause. This is the setup for something far worse than what came before. Hit subscribe right now, because this situation is moving faster than any single outlet can track, and you need to be here when the next development breaks. Let's go back to yesterday evening and reconstruct exactly what happened, because the sequence of events is everything. At approximately 5 p.m. Eastern Time on April 7th, Trump was hours away from a self-imposed deadline he had set on Sunday. He had demanded on social media, in language I will not repeat on this channel, that Iran immediately open the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran did not move fast enough, Trump escalated Tuesday morning with a post warning that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. That is a sitting American president threatening the extinction of a civilization on a social media platform. Let that settle for a moment. What pulled the world back from that edge wasn't American diplomacy. It wasn't back-channel negotiation between Washington and Tehran. It was Pakistan. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir, the Pakistani Army chief, made the calls that mattered. Sharif asked Trump for a 2-week extension. He asked Iran to open the strait as a goodwill gesture. And within 2 hours of Trump's deadline, both sides agreed. Trump posted that the ceasefire was happening. He called it a double-sided ceasefire. He claimed the U.S. had received a 10-point proposal from Iran and called it a workable basis for negotiation. Iran's Supreme National Security Council published its own statement. Their framing was slightly different. They said the United States had accepted Iran's principles as the basis for negotiations and had, quote, surrendered to the will of the Iranian people. Both sides claimed victory. Neither side had actually agreed on what the ceasefire covered. And that is where it all collapsed. Here is the Lebanon loophole, and I want you to understand exactly why this single omission is potentially more destabilizing than anything that happened in the 5 weeks of open warfare before yesterday. When the ceasefire was announced, Israel immediately issued a statement saying the agreement's terms did not extend to Lebanon. Israel's military then, within hours of the ceasefire taking effect, carried out what it described as its largest coordinated strike across Lebanon since the war expanded to the broader region. The White House confirmed Lebanon was not part of the deal. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters directly, Lebanon is not part of the 2-week agreement. Pakistan's Prime Minister, the man who brokered the ceasefire, immediately contradicted both Israel and the White House. Sharif said the ceasefire applied everywhere, including Lebanon. He announced that Islamabad would host delegations from the United States and Iran for talks later this week. 3 parties, 3 different understandings of what was agreed, all announced within hours of the same ceasefire. Iran's Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, was on the phone to Pakistani mediators within hours discussing what Tehran called ceasefire violations by Israel. An Iranian official speaking to Tasnim News put it in language that is worth understanding carefully. The official said, if America cannot rein in its rabid dog in the region, Iran will exceptionally help it in this matter, and that by force. Iran was not speaking hypothetically. By this morning, April 8th, the strait was closed. Now, let me explain the economic weapon Iran just reactivated, because the numbers are staggering and most of the coverage is not giving you the full picture. The Strait of Hormuz is a choke point too, 1 mile wide at its narrowest navigable point. Every day, approximately 17 million barrels of crude oil and liquefied natural gas transit that passage. That is roughly 17% of the world's daily oil consumption moving through a corridor you could drive across in 20 minutes. When Iran closes that strait, even partially, even just through threat and harassment, the effect on global energy markets is immediate and severe. Oil prices plunged 16% yesterday after the ceasefire was announced. Markets were pricing in the end of the disruption. Futures shot up for about 12 hours. Traders believed the crisis was de-escalating. This morning, with the Strait closed again and Iranian Navy messages warning tankers they will be targeted and destroyed, every one of those gains evaporates. Oil prices spike back, LNG futures surge, and the pain flows directly to consumers within days. Before this war started on February 28th, the average American was paying approximately $2.81 for a gallon of gasoline. That number has been climbing every week of the conflict. Every time the Strait closes, every time tankers divert around Africa on routes that add 12 to 15 days and enormous fuel costs to each voyage, that number climbs higher. The 17 million barrels that move through Hormuz every day do not just disappear when the Strait closes. They have to find another route or another source. And there is no route as efficient and no source as immediately scalable as the Gulf producers who depend on Hormuz to get their product to market. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, which bypasses Hormuz entirely, was damaged in an Iranian attack. Qatar, which shares the South Pars gas field with Iran, the largest natural gas field on Earth, containing 40% of the world's proven natural gas reserves, cannot increase production to compensate for the disruption because the infrastructure is shared. There is no clean workaround. When Hormuz closes, the world pays, and the world pays immediately. Here is what should be keeping American policymakers awake tonight. Iran's 10-point ceasefire proposal, which Trump called a workable basis for negotiation, includes a demand that the United States withdraw all combat forces from regional bases. It includes lifting all sanctions. It includes releasing all Iranian assets frozen abroad. It includes full payment of Iran's war-related damages. And it includes a protocol for controlled passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Controlled passage, not free passage, not an open passage, controlled passage, meaning Iran retains the ability to restrict, charge, or deny access to the Strait based on a protocol it helps design. That is not what Trump promised the American public when he threatened to destroy a civilization if the Strait was not opened. He promised complete, immediate, and safe opening. What Iran agreed to, and what their foreign minister confirmed publicly, is passage via coordination with Iran's armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. Those are two fundamentally different things. One is unconditional access. The other is access subject to Iranian approval. And now, less than 24 hours after that conditional agreement was announced, Iran has exercised that approval and closed the Strait in retaliation for Israeli strikes on Lebanon. The war did not end yesterday, it just changed form. There are three scenarios from this point forward, and none of them are clean. Scenario 1 is that Pakistan's mediation holds. Sharif gets both sides back to the table in Islamabad. Iran agrees to reopen the Strait in exchange for a commitment from Washington to rein in Israeli operations in Lebanon. Israel publicly objects but operationally scales back to avoid blowing up American diplomacy. The 2-week ceasefire limps forward. Oil markets stabilize. This is the best case, and it requires Israel to accept constraints on its Lebanon operation that its government has publicly and repeatedly said it will not accept. Scenario 2 is that the Lebanon issue becomes the permanent fracture in the ceasefire framework. Iran reopens the Strait conditionally, continues signaling threats over Lebanon, and both sides settle into a grinding, low-intensity standoff where no one is bombing Iranian nuclear facilities, but Hezbollah and Israel continue their war in the north with no resolution. The global economy lives under constant energy price pressure. American consumers absorb the cost. The region bleeds. Scenario 3 is that this morning's Strait closure is not a temporary signaling move. Iran has warned that its armed forces are simultaneously identifying targets in response to Israeli aggression in Lebanon. If those strikes go forward, if Iran launches another wave of ballistic missiles against Israeli territory or against American bases, the ceasefire collapses entirely. And Trump, who spent Tuesday morning warning about civilizational destruction, has to decide whether he meant it. A man who announced a ceasefire and called it a historic achievement cannot let that achievement dissolve without response. And a response means the war is back on, without the element of surprise that defined February 28th, with Iranian defenses partially reconstituted during the 2-week pause, And with every American ally in the Gulf having watched Washington fail to hold a ceasefire for a single day. Before we get to what happens next, your support keeps this analysis coming. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next 72 hours will determine whether Pakistan's mediation survives or whether the ceasefire collapses into something nobody has a plan for. You need to be here when it breaks. The deeper problem is not the Lebanon clause. The Lebanon clause is the symptom. The deeper problem is that the United States and Iran entered this ceasefire with irreconcilable definitions of what they had agreed to. Iran's National Security Council said America surrendered to the will of the Iranian people. Trump said America had met and exceeded all military objectives. Both cannot be true. At some point in the next 2 weeks, probably much sooner than 2 weeks, those two narratives will collide with reality. Either Iran accepts that the ceasefire does not cover Hezbollah operations in Lebanon, which means accepting that their most important regional proxy can be bombed during a ceasefire they agreed to. Or Israel accepts constraints on its Lebanon operation, which means accepting that a ceasefire negotiated over the Strait of Hormuz extends to a separate front that was not part of the original framework. Neither government can accept that. Iran cannot tell Hezbollah it is on its own during an Iranian ceasefire without destroying the entire logic of the axis of resistance. Israel cannot accept that a ceasefire negotiated to reopen a shipping lane also protects Hezbollah from Israeli airstrikes without fundamentally transforming the strategic position it entered this war to secure. This ceasefire was not a resolution. It was a pause that both sides are already treating as a victory that the other side must concede. And this morning, Iranian Navy vessels are broadcasting messages to oil tankers saying any vessel trying to enter the Strait will be targeted and destroyed. That is not the language of a country that believes the ceasefire is holding. Here is what the next 24 hours look like. Pakistan is making calls. Arakchi is on the phone with Islamabad. American diplomats are trying to figure out whether they can deliver Israeli restraint in Lebanon without publicly demanding it in a way that fractures the U.S.-Israel relationship. Iran is watching Israeli airstrikes over Beirut continue and calculating whether to escalate or hold. The oil markets opened this morning with the Strait closed. Traders who bought on the ceasefire announcement yesterday are watching their positions. Every hour the Strait stays dark adds pressure. And somewhere in the Gulf, oil tankers that thought they were going home yesterday are sitting anchored in open water, having received a message from the Iranian Navy that makes it very clear. The Strait is not open. The ceasefire is not holding. And the only safe course of action is to wait. 60 hours ago, Donald Trump threatened to destroy a civilization by 8 p.m. Iran called his bluff. Pakistan stepped in. A deal was announced. The world exhaled. This morning, Iran closed Hormuz again. The question is not whether this ceasefire survives. The question is how badly it fails, how fast it fails, and whether the next phase of this war looks like what came before or like something we do not yet have a framework to describe. Drop your analysis in the comments. Do you think Pakistan can hold this together? Does the Lebanon carve-out kill the ceasefire entirely? And if Iran follows through on its threat to identify and strike targets over Lebanon, does Trump have any choice but to go back to war? Subscribe, because this is not slowing down.